Welcome back to this edition of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, President of Dale Carnegie Training Japan and the best-selling author, Japan Sales Master. And I have the great pleasure today to have with me the CEO for Japan of Nielsen, very, very famous company, Luke Verwey. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you, Greg. Great to be here.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about leadership today, and I'm really pleased that Luke's here because in many ways, Luke's the perfect candidate for this type of interview because he's come to Japan about a year ago. So he's been leading in other countries and now comes to Japan. So the contrasts for you are going to be very dramatic, I would think. I mean, people like me who've been here a long time, we've adjusted to things in Japan, but everything's fresh for you. So just before we start into the concepts about leadership, for our viewers and listeners' sakes, tell us a little bit about your background, what you've done, how you've gotten into what you're doing, where you've worked previously, where you've led, in other words.
Sure. Well, I started my career in Australia. So I spent roughly my first decade working with consumer packaged goods companies. Through that time, that's when I first joined Nielsen. And I think that's where the journey has really sort of taken off. I had the idea that coming to Asia was going to be a great idea from a career standpoint. So 11 years later, 5 countries down, I'm slowly ticking off the markets off the Asian to-do list. So it's been very interesting. Throughout that time, I've worked in local roles, I've worked in regional roles, I've also worked in global roles. So I've had a lot of different type of experiences and actually experiences I'm very privileged to have had, which is very much around working with teams in front of you, working with teams virtually, but also working with teams across geographical borders as well.
So 11 years with Nielsen.
Yes.
And which countries did you work in?
So I first started my Asian experience in Hong Kong, which was a fantastic first sort of taste of Asian lifestyle. So that was back in 2008 that I arrived in Hong Kong. 2 years after that, I got the call up to move across to the Philippines. So I was recently married and had our first child in the Philippines and spent a couple of years running our team, our retail business in the Philippines. And then from there, moved across to Singapore, back into a regional role. So it's been a journey of a lot of contrast from geographical standpoints, but also a lot of contrast around cultures and just different ways about doing or trying to do global business in local markets.
So often we group Asia, which is actually not a country, but people think about Asia as one thing. And so within those countries, you've talked about Hong Kong, Philippines, Singapore, vastly different cultures, vastly different types of styles of work and leadership involved there. And then you come to Japan, which we always think of Japan as then another element of being different. Yes. So when you first got here and you started leading in Japan, what were the first things that sort of you noticed, oh, this is quite different to what I struck before in Singapore or Philippines or Hong Kong?
Yeah, I think it's like every country, there's nuances that Japan definitely has. And I think that as a leader, it's not necessarily about whether it's Japan or the Philippines. It's very much how do we try and find that calibration point? How do we find that balance between trying to do what we do for a multinational company, but then trying to adapt that to what works locally, how that resonates to the local workforce and the local workforce team. I think the reason why I'd say it's not just Japan is that diversity is also very important to us as a business. And here in Japan, 80% of our workforce is Japanese, but we do actually have 20% of our workforce that is also international. So for me, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a Japan way of doing things. The way I try and think about it is actually what is the right way that motivates the team here that's on the ground, which is actually made up of both Japanese and international executives as well.
So 20% is quite a large number, really, for most foreign multinational companies here. That's quite big. So in terms of, as I said before, when you first get here, you start applying your experience of leadership that you've built up in multiple countries, Australia, et cetera, as well. And then you start to find things a little bit need a bit of tweaking or need a little bit of changing here, style or communication, or what sort of things did you first bump into? Did you realise, oh, this isn't quite working, or this isn't what actually going to the sort of plan that I had in mind?
Yeah, so look, I'd say I'm still learning on a daily basis. So after 12 months, I still wouldn't say I'm an expert. I think, it's every day you learn more, and I think it's very much the concept of you arrive and you have a perspective of how you think, how you're informed. And then as each weeks go by, it's like peeling back the layers of the onion. You learn more and more, and you start to sort of understand more of the depth, I think, of what happens in terms of the culture. I think from where I see some of the challenges from a leadership perspective is language. Communication obviously is very critical in my role, because it's all about trying to create the vision. It's all about trying to rally people into one certain direction. Now, we take it for granted that people understand what we say. So I also have an Australian accent, which I think also makes it even more difficult for many people across Asia in particular to actually even understand what I'm trying to say. So that's one of, I think, the biggest elements, is how you can actually create messages, how you can communicate, but how you make sure that the right message is actually penetrating through and actually cascading from the top all the way down to the bottom. Because just because I stand up in front of a town hall, in front of a room full of people that may nod and may look like they're listening, the reality is that many people are not necessarily receiving the message necessarily in the way that I'm thinking that I'm delivering that message.
And that's a good point, because often we presume, because we've told people something, top to bottom, we're all aligned. How do you know if the people at the very, very bottom, say the most junior, the most new, usually most junior new female in the pecking order in Japan is probably at the bottom of the pile here. How do you know that most recently joined or relatively new or most junior person actually gets it? How do you know that?
You don't naturally. That's the challenge, is you've got to work so much harder. And I think this is one thing that I've learnt, is that you've got to continue to communicate over and over again, but then you also need to find ways and platforms that allow you to have conversations with the differing levels of the organisation. When I moved into Japan, I made the decision that we moved the executives out of offices and we sit on open plan. Because again, I was very conscious of the fact that, one, hierarchy plays a very big role here in Japan, but also just accessibility. So if I park myself behind a patent wall, that just creates another barrier that prevents people from being able to access me, to feel that they actually can talk to me. And so that's where we do have a number of different initiatives that we drive around how we can find ways to respect and cascade the flow of information, but also find ways to make sure that the leadership is finding ways to connect with the more junior people. So doing things like junior XCOM committees, where we have a great representation of some of our junior future leaders working side by side with our XCOM to help us on some of these things. We have an employee engagement committee that does the same sort of task. We do roundtables. I also take the opportunity every month to try and go and have lunch with one of the more junior executives as well, just as a way to always be finding the opportunity to listen, but also just to reinforce some of the messages as well.
Were these things that you introduced, were these new to the business, or was this something that had been there before and you continued it, or this is something you introduced?
It was a combination, is that we reinvigorated some things. So some things were in place, but not necessarily working to the way that we would have liked to seen them work. So we have reinvigorated things like our junior XCOM. We have actually split out, said this employee engagement committee, because we sort of feel the opportunity to actually split those groups. That we have one team that's very much focused on more business core related types of sort of projects, But then we have the employee engagement committee, and their job is not just to set up parties and matcha Fridays or things like that. We are really working with them again to find ways at how we can drive engagement across and down into the organisation, because I think that's the other thing that I'm also very conscious of, is that, if I like it or not, I am getting older. I am no longer thinking the same way that actually the core of our organisation thinks in terms of the millennials. So that's where we're trying to sort of drive more bottom-up approaches and really work with them to sort of help us develop strategies around what we can do around employee engagement, as opposed to myself, our leadership team, sitting around a table and sort of coming up with ideas of what we once did or what we think might actually work.
And how about for your executive team? I mean, they've got their nice office and nice and quiet in there and get a lot of work done, and then you turn up and my office is gone. So how did that go down?
It's not easy. It's always, again, about trying to find a balance about, again, how we can respect and leverage our global know-how, our global strengths, but also make sure that we are trying to respect the local culture as well. And I think that's the one thing that I think we still don't get it right all the time, is how we can actually work with our team to approach some things differently, to think about things in a different way. And because I think that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is how we can create a vision about where we want the business to be and why we actually want the business to get to that point. And I think the why is one thing that I've really learnt to appreciate over the last 12 months is, having worked in Singapore and some of the other markets, you can often just get away with saying we need to do this and it gets done. What I found here in Japan is the why is very, very important for people to understand exactly why we need to do something, or why are you telling me to do this, as opposed to just accepting what it is that you're telling me to do. So I think that's one thing that I've become more and more conscious of. It's something that I'm working harder and harder each day on, is to make sure that whenever we do talk about what needs to be done, we're spending actually more time elaborating and talking about the why that sits behind that as well.
And Japan's often an outlier around these things in terms of a global organisation. And you talked about engagement before. Do you run annual or biannual engagement surveys?
Yeah, so we have effectively an annual employee engagement. Well, we actually do two. So we have our big global annual one, but then we do little pulse checks sort of throughout the year as well.
Yeah, in my time working in multinational companies here, we always had, APAC hub meeting would be in Singapore or Hong Kong or somewhere, and you'd be sitting there, and then up come the charts, right, on the engagement survey, and you've got the world, and then APAC is always lower than the average for the world, and then at the bottom of APAC would be Japan. Yes. Numbers are extremely low, and you get this tremendous amount of pressure. You've got to get those numbers up in Japan, So has that been your experience when you sort of APAC sort of sits a bit lower than everywhere else and Japan sits low in APAC? Is that how it's been for you too?
It is. And to be honest, we see that in a lot of our surveys. Like, we look at consumer confidence across a vast range of markets globally. And again, Japan tends to sit towards the bottom of the list when it comes to overall confidence. When we do surveys, we do just tend to find that, there is generally more of a pessimism in terms of the way that responses are submitted when it comes to surveying and questions.
Well, your whole business is basically surveying. Nielsen's is that type of agency. So is there a type of Japan factor that's taken into account that, yes, well, there's going to be a 5% Japan factor in any numbers and we should allow for that, or you just look at the numbers?
I think it's like anything. The numbers are important, but actually how you interpret the numbers and how you use the numbers is actually more important. I think the numbers are the foundation that give you the diagnostic. It's then about, as you say, understanding, well, what does this really mean because if I compare the engagement score of somebody in Tokyo as opposed to the Philippines, there is a vast amount of difference. But if you put those two people side by side and you ask them questions about, their experience at the company, what they're doing, you probably would find that the gap in terms of their overall experience probably isn't as big as what the numeric gap would sort of suggest up front. So, I think we use the numbers again as a bit of a diagnostic to try and get a pulse of the organisation. But where we actually spend a lot more time in is actually about key areas where we're potentially behind the mean or where we see opportunities. So really trying to sort of pinpoint what we need to do or where we need to focus our efforts as opposed to what just that one overall index number may be.
Yeah, because those surveys really break it down for you into different areas. So are there particular areas that are consistently an area for attention in Japan that from a Japanese workforce point of view, these are particular things they put a high value on and they're demanding around those areas or they're dissatisfied around those areas?
Yeah, I think the one thing, it fits, again, I think this comes back to some of the bigger sort of leadership principles and the way that decision making happens here as well, is that, I think the collective is something that comes through a lot. Is, again, I think people respect hierarchy in Japan, but actually the decision making is a much more collective decision. And that's one where I see a lot of, when we do these types of surveys, is if we're not doing enough or we're not bringing people in to be a part of some of these decisions, to be a part of what we're doing, that's where very quickly I think we tend to see things becoming an issue. So, we've introduced things like public voice systems in the last 12 months, which again is very much designed to sort of say, look, we feel that we need to change something and need to evolve something. We'd like to throw it out to get the public voice from people, because I think just feeling that they've actually getting the platform to raise their voice and to feel that their voice is feeding up into a decision-making process, I feel is very important, or at least that's what I see in my business.
How does it work? Is that something that sort of sits outside the company? They can go to a particular website and put comments in there and no attribution, so they feel safe to make a comment?
Yeah, we do it internally. I generally try to focus on speed and cost optimization. So, we have a couple of directors who have taken on the responsibility for this, and this is where they have, we send out very simple surveys that become basically anonymous, and we just basically pick back the results and we sort of draw them into our discussions and decision-making process.
And how about aligning the results of those discussions based on the results of the survey with actions that you've taken? Because often they make a comment and then nothing happens, so they don't feel like making a second comment. What's the point? Wasting my time. But if they make a comment and they see some change or they hear you referring to it, it encourages people to say, well, I have got a voice that's actually being heard here. Do you see that happening, or do you need to do more to get that to come out?
We try, but again, I think it's something that we need to do much more of, which is about the follow-up communication. We've done a number of different things which have been based on direct inputs and feedback from the teams, even subtle things around office environment, equipment, where we have listened, we've acted, and but I do feel again it's always about just continuing to bring it back to we heard, we acted, and now this is what we've done.
And that's an issue, isn't it? I mean, you talk about time, right? We're all busy. So as busy bosses, we've got many projects on, we've got a lot going on. So our time is incredibly valuable to us, obviously, to get through everything. Yet we've got to carve out, I would say in Japan, probably extra additional time for that consultative decision making, additional time for the communication piece. Did you notice that in terms of the burden on you or the impost on you from your own time usage compared to other countries that, in Japan, I have to spend more time in these areas than I did before?
Yeah, I'd be very honest. I mean, that's still my biggest criticism of myself.
Oh, okay.
Is I'm very strong and biased for action. I don't like standing still. I like movement and progression, and I think that's where I definitely prioritise speed ahead of the consultation early, which probably didn't help with some of those first initial sort of engagements. And even now today, again, it's really about how we find that balance of, as you say, if I'm being asked to drive something from above the market, sometimes it's just got to get done. And I think, again, that's the other area that I am trying to focus a lot more on, is how I can try and balance the different needs, the different objectives of speed versus the consultation to really get people engaged on. So, like I said, I'd probably give myself a B or a C for the first 12 months on that one. That's probably been the best hindsight sort of learning for myself, and one that we are trying, or I'm particularly trying to really sort of focus on moving forward, is very much how I can sort of consult more, but also consult on a more broader basis, to make, again, the wider team feel engaged.
I guess getting change anywhere is difficult. The old joke about, everyone believes in change,
Yep.
but they're actually talking about everyone else should change and they should stay the same, is what they're talking about.
Yep.
But you come in, you want to have some changes made, you want to make things happen. Did you get that typical Japan pushback about, well, this is Japan, it won't work here, you don't understand the market, you don't understand the clients, that'll never fly? And did you get that pushback?
Yeah, we did, and I think it's, again, this has been another good learning for myself. Is I like change. I embrace change. I get bored when things are static, but that's where I think I also need to do a better job of embracing change and the way we communicate change in actually a very different way, because people don't like change. Yes, people in Japan don't like change, but actually people in other countries don't actually like change in most cases. And I think, again, that's more about how we can drive change without talking about change. Because, one of the great things about Japan is innovation. Japan loves innovation. Like, if we look at a lot of the businesses and that we work with, a lot of the brands in the retail sector, there is so much innovation that happens here in Japan, and consumers actually love innovation. So how we can drive change but position it in a way that we are innovating, for instance, how we go digital as opposed to changing a process. So that's one thing that I sort of feel that, again, it's been probably more of a recent sort of learning for myself, is talk less about change, focus more on actually the positive impacts of, again, how we can drive innovation, how we can approach things, and use thought and thought leadership as a way to drive what needs to happen.
If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. So innovation is a really hot topic everywhere, I think. And you're right, Japan is very innovative. Yet it's also one of those things in Japan that often the hierarchical nature of how companies are run doesn't encourage ideas to come out. Also, the technology, for want of a better word, that middle managers use to draw out ideas in Japan is pretty hopeless from what we've seen in our, dealing with different companies. How do you encourage those people who don't have position, don't have power, but may have great insight to have their ideas come out? And how do you encourage your middle managers to help them do that? And just give us a context of how many people are in Nielsen in Japan?
So we have just over 150.
Right, so that's a
total
big
business,
crew,
so-
150, right? So you've got a good sway of middle managers in there. How do we get the people at the bottom to feel that their ideas can be heard and they want to put their ideas out there? And how do you get the middle managers to encourage them to put their ideas out there and make sure that it's not, the typical thing in Japan is they look around the room, oh, Luke started in the company before I did, so I won't say anything until he says something, or Luke's older than me, or Luke's a man and I'm a woman. They've got all these self-restricting cultural things going on which hold them back to freely speak up. So how do you get around that?
Yeah, I think there's many different mechanisms, and again, I think this is still a work in progress for us. So we're far from, I think, having the magical formula or sort of solution, but again, I think it's about how we can create platforms to open up those voices. Again, using things like the Junior XCOM, the Employee Engagement Committee, where we are getting like-minded, young, dynamic guys together to sit around, a table and try and come up with solutions to some of the problems that we have in our business. Recently, I sponsored a project where we're a part of a developed Asia region, so Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. And we threw we sort of got 2 representatives from each of the markets, and we sort of threw them a business challenge. And we got them to work together for the first time, where we're also integrating our team with Japan to our neighbour countries as well. And it's amazing when you give these guys the opportunity, the quality of what they give back to you. And they reported back to us about a month back, and it was brilliant, the work that they actually did. And I was super proud of our team here in Japan, because I was sponsoring the project, so my 2 guys unfortunately had to sort of take a bit more of a leadership role in that process. Well, unfortunate for them, but actually good for
Why
us.
was it unfortunate for them?
Well, I think because it just made them feel very uncomfortable. It put them out of their comfort zone. But because actually they were the conduit between the working group and myself from a physical, geographical standpoint, they had to naturally sort of assume that role. And they did a great job. And again, it was just another great reminder about how when you do give the people the opportunity, you give them the platform, they can really do some great things. Now, as you say, I think we're trying to do that through some of these councils, through some of these types of sort of projects, etc. We also, the way that we assess people is we don't just talk about what you do. We also talk about how you do it, because we want a high-performing culture. We want a high-performing team, but we don't want to get there by driving bad behaviours and driving individuals' agendas to drive their own goals. And I think that's what's also very, very important for us, is that, yes, you've got the results, but actually we're going to spend 50% of the conversation talking about what you've done and how you've participated, how you've actually worked with your peers, how you've found opportunities to speak up, how you actually work to our operating principles, for example. I think there are other mechanisms that also just try and help people feel that actually they can speak up, but they actually should speak up, because that's actually what the company values and that's what the company will actually reward on.
So you've quite a qualitative aspect to your performance assessment there, not just on did you get the numbers.
How did you get the numbers?
So is this a new thing, or has this been like this for a while?
This is something that we as Nielsen do, something that we've been doing for a couple of years now. And personally, I really embrace it. I think it's a great thing, especially as a leader of a team, that it really does help facilitate more team, more collaboration, and making sure that, again, we've got people working well, working together, and integrating to make sure that we can achieve our goals.
And how have you seen that translate into change of behaviour particularly from your leaders?
It's still hard. Again, like anything, it's a journey. I think meritocracy is also another challenge, is how we can actually spend time, how we actually drive process that ensures that managers are actually having great conversations with their employees, and it's happening not just in December at the end of the year. You did a good job, or you didn't do a good job, or I'm going to give you X rating. That, I think, is one thing that we are working hard on, is how we can drive more continuous dialogue, how we can get our managers and employees connecting more frequently, so that we are creating a two-way dialogue ultimately that allows us to drive impact down to the organisation, but also allow the employees to drive their voice up.
For big organisations, Japan's often a black hole in the sense of very few Japanese executives go outside of Japan. Like normally for big companies, they've got a pool of very talented individuals, and they want them to be mobile, to apply them in any country, in any particular position where they need them. And it tends to be that people come to Japan, like yourself, but it's not so common that Japanese go somewhere else. For example, one of your executives now goes and runs Australia, or runs Philippines, or runs South America or something like that. How's that working? Are you getting that type of facility to have the ability to move talent where the organisation needs that talent the most, or does it tend to be that black hole and everyone stays working diligently and well, but only in Japan?
Yeah, we're quite privileged with the sort of people that work with us. I think, because we are an international company, because we're a multinational company, we see a lot of people who do join us are actually coming in. They may be Japanese, but they may have gone to university in the US, or they may have spent a few years working in the US. We do move people across markets. So one of my leaders at the moment spent 5 years in Singapore and came back to Japan last year. So I think that's one of the great things about Nielsen, is that we do really value diversity. We do try to give people opportunities to move around. And it is something that we are seeing more and more of, in terms of people raising their hands and saying that they are interested to actually go abroad. I think it is step by step. We're looking at things like short-term assignments, bubble assignments, that do give people an opportunity to go and spend a couple of months away without making the big full commitment of pulling up stumps and setting up home somewhere else. So I think there's still definitely more opportunity. There's probably still a surplus of inbound as opposed to sort of outbound. But it is something that, again, coming back to this sort of check-in process and how we're sort of driving dialogues, is really sitting down and trying to sort of get to those sorts of needs, and understanding, does person X want to go abroad? Do they want to work in a emerging economy in Southeast Asia? Do they want to move to Europe or the US? And I think actually in our actual formal assessment process, we do actually ask people in the system to talk about, are you mobile? Are you motivated? Again, even list out, where would you like to work? Because these are the sort of flags that we actually do take, we look at, and then as opportunities do come up, it does help guide us to connect opportunity with aspiration.
And are you seeing that the people are putting their hand up and saying, yes, I want to work in Europe, I want to work in the US, I want to work in wherever?
Yeah, we've got a couple of people in our team who have gone and done short-term assignments. I'd still say that, again, it's not a big part of our DNA, but I think especially at the more junior levels, we're seeing more and more appetite to sort of learn more and sort of experience more beyond Japan.
Just on that point about the junior levels, I mean, you also do mid-career hiring as well, I know, but how are you going in the sense of there's a huge war for talent? And I remember in the 90s, I think McKinsey did a report called The War for Talent. And here we are, we're in 2019, soon to be 2020, and we've got a war for talent in Japan where there's a much more limited pool of English-speaking, experience with different cultures, young people available to work anywhere in Japan, and also Japanese companies, as they become more global, are looking for that talent as well. So in the past, where as a multinational company, we didn't have to compete with the Japanese domestic companies to hire this type of talent. Today, we're competing directly with them, and so the pool is really quite small and shrinking. How have you found it in terms of being able to find people to hire them into the business?
Extremely difficult, and it's at all levels. That's actually one of the biggest frustrations is when you have budget, you have headcount, and you just can't get the CVs through onto your desk. And I think we're trying to, we've recently brought in a new HR leader. Again, we're looking at ways that we can approach things differently because, it is an extremely tight labour market, and just trying to source the right people to come in is one of our biggest challenges right now.
Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now. If you're at 150, thinking about the future, thinking about adding more talent, is it 200? Is it 250? Is it 175? What's the sort of goal in terms of the business plan and thinking of expanding the business that you need numbers of people?
Yeah, we're a small business in Japan compared to where we are in most other markets. We don't have a number that we're looking at or a target at the moment. I think it's this, right now our biggest priority is to make sure we've got the right team focused on the right goals, and we are moving the business in a positive direction. And I think, but to do that, it's still, so we have a number of vacancies that we are working to fill today, and doing things, for instance, like next month we're going to be participating in the Boston Career Forum. We haven't done that before, but again, it's this thinking about how do we approach consistent problems but in different ways. And I think the great thing about the Boston Career Forum is that wasn't my idea. That was actually one of the ideas of one of our team members who said, I think we should actually do this because it gets us into actually a great pool of candidates that actually matches the profile of our business quite well. So I think that was a great example, again, of how innovation in terms of how we do things is starting to come through from the teams. And I think that's the reason why I guess a big part of what we're doing is that we do think it's a great idea, but I also want to be supportive and embracing when our people are actually putting their hand up and putting something on the table.
Are you finding Japan as a source of innovation that can be taken to the rest of the organisation? Because in many ways, the Japanese consumer here is so demanding. The drive on everything must be perfect, no mistakes, that high level of service quality required, all these things which are typical in Japan, not typical anywhere else. But you find that you're able to take things from Japan and then export those to other parts of Nielsen to change your business globally?
Yeah, I think it's something that we can do a lot more of. Process is king in Japan, and I think for a multinational company, process is very, very important for us. So how we can actually adapt, take some of the things that have done here in Japan and help, especially across Asia, for example, how we can find ways to do things is quite interesting, because I think one of the things that we do at our business is that we help a lot of Japanese companies here in Tokyo drive their international expansion. And if they're looking at Southeast Asia or Africa, they actually partner with our teams here in Tokyo to help them through that process. And that's, I think through that process, our teams are actually the ones who are working side by side with our colleagues in Southeast Asia or in Africa, so that we are helping them understand the Japanese way of how they like to have their projects run, how the sort of precision that they expect. So in a way, that's actually an informal export of innovation that we are doing, is that we are working with our emerging sort of countries and actually working with them to really bring in a Japanese approach to how we run consumer measurement projects, for example.
I find with time, Dale Carnegie is a global organisation. We're in 100 plus countries. So the concept of speed, time, turnaround, these sorts of things, like the Japanese expectation of when things will be done, is very quick. And also their long-term planning. So they will be scheduling training quite a long way out in the future. And so someone from overseas will have something they want done, and the time frames are very, very short, whereas trainers are already booked out. That's the Japanese companies are way ahead of you in that sense, and they're planning. So you think you can just come and do it, or you think it's okay to take a few days to get an answer on something. Well, it's not okay. So have you found those sorts of things are quite different here?
It is, and I think this sort of comes back to the earlier point about speed and agility versus process. Mm-hmm. And I think that is one of those real pivot points for us is, as a global organisation, we're prioritising speed, we're prioritising agility. The planning cycles are getting shorter, yet here in Japan, the process needs to be followed and needs to be sort of played out. I think that how we try and, again, find that better calibration between the way that we're operating globally as opposed to how we then execute that here locally is still part of the work in progress.
So for you, thinking forward, what would you say would be maybe one or two areas where you're going to put a lot of attention into the business as the leader? And that might be representing the company outside, it may be internal, it may be representing Japan within the Nielsen system. Where are some sort of key areas for you to focus on?
So I think the first one is how I can empower the team, because we've got great executives. We've got a great team of people, and it comes back to this concept of we've got to make them accountable to stepping up. We've got to help them, empower them to actually take that next step forward, especially the leadership team is, they can make better decisions than what I can about how things work in Japan, because a lot of them have worked in Japan. They're Japanese. They understand the nuances much better than what I can. So that's, I think, the first thing is how I spend less time making decisions and actually spending more of my time facilitating those decisions and really empowering the team to actually start to do a lot more just self-governing, self-leadership in terms of how they're sort of operating. Because ultimately, my leaders are the ones who are running the teams. They have the people, and it's, my personal view is that if they have the ownership, it's about their decisions, it's about their view. I'm here just to help enable them to do that. Is a big part of where I'd like to sort of spend my time, at least over the next 12 months, to really see our leadership team really coming together as a very strong, tight-knit group that ultimately is the ones that are leading the business.
So if you're going to give some advice to someone, say you came 12 months or so ago, right? And you were thinking, okay, this person's rung me up. Hey, Luke, I've got this job. They're going to send him to Japan. I've got about 200 people to look after over there. This is our business. And hey, what advice can you give me? What would be 3 pieces of advice you'd give them?
So I think the first one is listening. Listening is very important, and I think one that I'm probably accused that I don't always listen as much as I should, because I think again it's feedback is given very differently here in Japan, and sometimes feedback can be disguised, and if you're not listening to that, or if you're not appreciating that, or even picking up that someone's giving you feedback, that can be, again, very, very detrimental very quickly.
So you're talking about the feedback's rather indirect and subtle, and if you're not tuned up to those subtleties, you might just completely miss the whole thing.
Miss
right?
the whole thing, exactly. Right. And I think that's the thing, is that if you do that once, you might get a second chance. You do that twice, then potentially that person is going to stop saying what they need to say. So I think, listening, but really taking the time to try and understand what is being said, and not just take things at surface value. I think the high contextual element is definitely something that I'm very much aware of, and something that I think is very, very important for international leaders who do come into Japan.
What would be another one? So we've got listening. What else do we have?
I think the other one is, it's very easy to get stuck into these sweeping statements about Japan and how it works in Japan, and I think it's also about understanding the team. It's about understanding the culture that exists in the business, because it's not like it's like anything. It's not one size fits all, and the culture of a team, the culture of an organisation can vary quite significantly. Even if I look across our business units, there are subcultures within the teams, and that's probably the other one. Is I think you need to take advice, you need to take what you read in books, but again, you need to then calibrate that with what you see, what you learn, and again, what you listen, because again, if you think about the diversity aspect, is you're in Japan, but maybe a vast majority of your staff are Japanese, but then within that, a majority may have actually spent time studying in the US. You've got a segment who are homegrown Japanese people. So in a way, there is no one Japanese playbook, I guess you'd sort of say. And it's very important that you just take the time, you really understand the people. And it's again something that I try to sort of focus on, is not to talk about the Japan way. It's actually, what is it that I can do that resonates with the group of people who are sitting in front of me, as opposed to trying to put labels about who they are, or where they've come from.
What's the third piece of advice?
I think just learning. It's interesting that when you start to really try and learn about the culture, that you start to also, things start to make a little bit more sense to you.
How do you go about learning?
I think it's just about getting out and seeing the way that things work. And I like to travel, so we tend to take the kids and jump in the car on the weekends, or jump on a Shinkansen and get out and see the country. And because I do feel that the more time you spend on understanding the way things work, why things are different here in Japan, that's actually what's important, because it's not right or it's not wrong. But what's important is actually understanding why it potentially is happening that way, and then understanding, well, what can I do differently, or how can we approach something a bit differently, in the way that we're running our business. And I think for me, the language is still a barrier for that. It's amazing where, having worked in other countries where you can talk to a taxi driver, it's amazing. You pick up a lot of interesting things just from talking to like a taxi driver, for example, whereas it's one thing I struggle with here is I just don't get some of that, chatter that you necessarily would, where you can sort of just understand what the local topics are and what people are thinking and what they're sort of saying, which does, again, just help you correlate more data points in terms of what's happening out there.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very good coverage of leadership in Japan, and really appreciate Luke taking the time today, because I know he's extremely busy. But I really wanted his perspective as someone who's new to Japan, been here 12 months, running 150 people. It's a brand name, Nielsen, famous company all around the world. So it is quite intriguing to see how Japan is the same, how Japan is the different. So Luke, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
We appreciate that. And we look forward to joining the next episode of Japan's top business interviews. Thank you very much for watching.